Welcome, Duke alumni, family, and friends to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary educational program organized in a set of thematic courses. I am Jo Supernaw, Senior Director of Faculty Engagement with the Lifelong Learning Team at Duke Alumni Engagement and Development. Thank you so much for joining our program today, A Life Well Lived. This program is part of our theme, Transformative Ideas. And this theme's actually inspired by a program with the same title that's offered to Duke sophomores through Trinity College of Arts and Sciences. In the Transformative Ideas program, students explore questions of meaning, value, purpose, and spirit that challenge us as humans. And during this Forever Learning Institute, you get the chance to engage with some of the exact same ideas and questions as our current Duke students and are guided by the outstanding faculty from across the disciplines. Moderating our discussion today is Kaven Rowe, the Vice Dean of the Divinity School and the Ivy Distinguished Professor. Please welcome to the Forever Learning Institute, Kaven Rowe.
Hi, Jo. Thank you, and welcome to all of you. I'm glad to see you all here for today's session, which is called A Life Well Lived, and is built on and comes from the sophomore experience course called The Good Life, which many of us on the program today have had a chance to teach in and are currently teaching in. I want to make a couple of comments about the subject matter of the Good Life course as a way to set the table for the discussion that we're going to have throughout the session today. The comments are these. First, the good life. The assumption there is something like this. Human beings want to live a good life, at least as opposed to the other sorts. Nobody actually starts off by saying, you know what kind of life I'd like? I'd like to have a bad life. I'd like to have a ruined life. I'd like to get to the end of my life when it comes my turn to go, look back across my life and see, that was pretty bad. We all seem to have the desire and assumption and longing even for a good life. The second thing that I want to mention is that there are different answers to the question of how you actually get one of those things. How is it that by the end of your life, you can look back and say, I have had a good life. I have lived a life that has been well-formed. And those answers range from personal opinions all the way to millennia-long religious and philosophical traditions. And then the third thing, and this is something of a mystery about being human, but it is an indelible part of being human, and that is this. There are things that get in the way of having a good life. It's not just there for the taking. There is something ineradicable about human life that makes it difficult to achieve a good life. And those things can be thrown up by life itself, its density, its difficulty, its catastrophes, and can also be things that we ourselves put in our own way. Hurdles we have to jump over, walls we actually build that we ourselves have built and then run into. All of the panelists today are going to be addressing those three things from a different perspective in the traditions that they speak for today. And I'll come to those in just a minute. But we actually want to hear from you first. So in just a second, you're going to have a poll question that is going to come up. There it comes in just 1 second, and it's going to ask a very basic question. What do you believe is the most important factor that makes a life well lived? And we've given you a few options. We know there are more than four. Life is pretty incredibly complicated, but there are four big ones. So go ahead and respond to the poll if you can. And when we come back, I will introduce our panelists and my distinguished colleagues. I think our results should be coming in here in just a minute. And there they are. It looks like we have, of the four possible things that are the most important things that we would need, most important factors to living a good life, resources actually is the least important relative to how you all answered, 4%. Community, so family, friends, neighbors, co-workers, and so forth, 41%. Gratitude, which you might think of as a posture, a way of being in the world that includes a kind of contentment or recognition or appreciation or thankfulness. That seems to be very important, 36%. Health, that's an interesting. I would have guessed that one would come up much higher, but that's 19%. So we've got three relatively well-populated answers and one sparsely populated answer of resources. So we'll have a chance to talk about all these things, both in our breakout rooms and more generally as we hear from our panelists, whom I now would like to introduce. So we have four of my colleagues joining us today, all of whom I've known for a long time, or at least some of them for a very long time and some for relatively so. They're distinguished scholars, well known here at Duke for their research, for their contribution to the teaching mission of the university, and for their investment in the lives of students who come here to learn and to think about questions of how to live a good life. The first one is really the founder and convener of the course, The Good Life, and the lead on transformative ideas in a university-wide developmental capacity. And that is Professor Jed Adkins, who is the Blake Byrne Associate Professor of Classical Studies. We'll turn to him first in just a minute. Dr. Adkins will be speaking this morning from the perspective of the Stoic tradition. What is it that Stoicism has to say about the good life, about how you might obtain one of those, and how you might deal with the obstacles that come in one's way? The second person that is joining us is Dr. Sarah Jean Barton, who is an assistant professor of orthopedic surgery and also an assistant professor of theological ethics in the Divinity School, and she will be speaking from the Christian tradition and addressing those same concerns. The third person is Mona Hassan, and Professor Hassan is an associate professor of religious studies in the Department of Religious Studies and will be speaking on behalf of the Islamic tradition and how to think about the good life question there. And our final distinguished guest is Professor David Wong, who is the Susan Fox and George D. Beischer Distinguished Professor of Philosophy. We look forward to hearing what you all have to say. And so we'll turn it over to you, Professor Adkins, as the convener of the course, The Good Life, and as the one who's thought about how this whole sense of a well-lived life might impact sophomores at Duke. We'll turn to you first and hear anything you want to say about that. And of course, also your Stoicism and what it has to say for us today.
Well, thank you, Professor Rowe, and thank you to all the alumni who have tuned in today. It's so great to see your faces. And my job here on the panel today is to represent Stoicism, which is one of 7 traditions in the course that we're bringing into dialogue about life's biggest questions. We, in addition to some of the traditions we have here today, in the past we've had Judaism, we've had scientific naturalism, we've had Buddhism, and all of these utilitarianism, and all of these questions and traditions are designed to invite our students into asking what are the different possibilities to give us an account for how we live, how we die, how we suffer, how we love, how we think about freedom, how we think about justice. So that's the course. Today, I'm going to be speaking about the good life with respect to the Stoic tradition. Stoicism is a philosophy that began in ancient Greece, but people today draw on Stoicism. What does Stoicism believe? Well, Stoics believe that the fundamental problem and the obstacle to obtaining the good life is ourselves, in particular, the way we think about the world. The reason that we're unhappy is that we try to control things that are outside of our control. And so we inevitably fail and we become stressed out, fearful, and anxious. And all of these bad emotions keep us from living flourishing and good lives. We can't control whether we have health or wealth or success. It's good if we have them, but we shouldn't stake our happiness on their presence. Otherwise, our happiness will be vulnerable to misfortune. And the Stoics think that the good life should be one that's constant and steady, not one that's being constantly threatened by uncertainty. In the past 5 years or so, I've had 5 people in my immediate circle diagnosed with stage 3 or stage 4 cancer. All were very healthy. 3 are now dead. Stoicism says that the good life needs to be robust enough for you to say that you're happy, that your life was well lived, even when it's cut short by cancer or by some other disability out of your control. Well, how do you think about the good life? Very simply, the Stoics like to use the metaphor of a ball game. And here we're at Duke, so basketball is the ball metaphor that I'll use. Things like health and sickness and wealth and poverty, success and failure are the basketballs with which we play the game of life. We can't worry about the ball or fret about whether we're a 5'9" point guard or a 7-foot tall center. What we need to do is to pass the ball skillfully, take skillful shots, dribble the ball well. We can control these things. And these skills, which over time become ingrained capacities that we can exercise without thinking, just by second nature, the Stoics call virtues. Stoic virtues are things like justice and wisdom, courage and moderation, and they are essential for happiness. The Stoics indeed even believe that these virtues can be sufficient for happiness. So if you play the game of life well and with skill, you win. You can be said to live the good life, regardless of the outcome.
Thank you, Professor Atkins. Professor Barton, we'll turn to you. In good alphabetical order, if you would like to say a few words about the good life from the perspective from which you speak this morning.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Rowe, and welcome to everyone on the call. So as someone who approaches these questions of the good life from the perspective of Christian theology and ethics, I want us to think a little bit about how those categories that just appeared on the poll might be considered from a Christian perspective. So let's take community first, which was the largest percentage of those gathered us here today about what we think composes the good life. So in Christian scripture, the books of the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, we see Jesus emphasize throughout the gospel books in particular that the greatest commandment that we live in this life is to love God and to also love our neighbors as we would love ourselves. Jesus specifies in the book of Matthew that all of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So this commandment to be a community who loves God and loves neighbor is a central and core foundational part of the good life from the Christian perspective. And I think the other aspects of the good life really relate to the shape of this Christian community within our tradition. So for example, thinking about resources and their place in the good life, the Christian tradition has long emphasized that resources are held in common. And so in this community of loving God and loving neighbor, if someone is in need, their needs are provided for by the community that loves God and loves the neighbor, because ultimately possessions are viewed as those that are not private and personal things for us to keep or squander as we wish personally, but for wise communal stewarding and sharing. Likewise, if we think about the category of health, which we had about 20% of folks say was the most important aspect of the good life, we see in the Christian tradition that followers of Jesus participate in particular practices that promote health in a certain way as part of the good life. Practices of prayer if someone is ill, practices of healing and of restoration. Jesus's own acts of healing are really prominent in the Christian scripture. And so if someone is born ill or born disabled, someone becomes ill or becomes disabled at some point in their life, in the Christian tradition, we would respond to these with practices of healing. I want to be really clear that I am sharing deliberately about practices of healing as a core part of the Christian tradition and not practices of cure. In the Christian tradition, healing is not synonymous with cure or the removal or the erasure of disease, disability, or suffering. So health and healing are a part of the good life in the Christian tradition, but the practices of healing that Christians partake in are primarily about restoration to this community of love of God and neighbor, about transformation within that community, and not necessarily about bodily limits. And this particular conviction about healing is something I carry into my work as a healthcare professional, as a clinician who teaches and researches in occupational therapy at the School of Medicine at Duke, as well as my theological work. But we might be able to visit that more a bit later. I'll turn it over to my other colleagues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barton. Professor Hassan, we'll turn to you now.
Thank you for the introduction, for hosting, and for everyone who's attended with us here today. It's an honor to be here and to have a very important discussion with all of you. As Kevin said earlier, I teach Islamic studies and history here at the university. And one of the things, the good life is explicitly discussed in the Quran, and so much of the Islamic tradition is really about how can people live a good life. And just as a starting point, I wanted to share one of the verses from the Quran that talks about living rather than the good life to highlight something that we've already touched on a little bit. And in translation, the verse says, "O you who believe, respond to God and his messenger when they call you to that which gives you life. Know that God comes between a person and their heart, and that you will be gathered to him." And the reason I wanted to start here is it really helps lay the foundation for Muslims believe that God is clearly speaking to the living in this text. So what does it mean to respond to God and his messenger, to that which brings you to life, right? It highlights this point that there are many layers of life and living that we can aspire to, which extend far beyond just the soul being encased within the body. That rather what is meant by life and a good life is truly greater. And one of these concepts is that remembrance of God, remembrance of the divine, brings the heart to life. But in terms of God calling us to that which brings us life, that's the whole unfolding of the message of the Quran and how it's exemplified in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, whom Muslims believe was the final messenger in a long chain of messengers, beginning with Adam and sent to every group of people on the face of the earth, so that all peoples were called to God and to what would be good for them in this world and the next. And another verse that complements this in speaking about the good life is that whoever does good deeds, whoever does righteous deeds, whether male or female, and is a believer, we shall most surely give them a good life and reward them according to the best of their actions. And see, you hear the very powerful gender egalitarianism of Islam come through this verse, that Muslims believe God specifically says whether male or female, and is speaking to all people, all humanity, all genders, all races, and is, again, pointing the connection between that it's not enough to have good intentions, but that faith, that belief needs to manifest itself in terms of being of benefit towards oneself and to others. That again, there are different layers and gradation that a person grows and deepens. And, if the analogy is like a tree, that it grows and blossoms and strengthens and is able to provide shade and fruit and be of benefit to other people. I'm certainly not, there's a statement, a hadith, a report of the Prophet Muhammad saying that, defining who is a Muslim. And he said that a Muslim is somebody whom other people are safe from their tongue and their hands, meaning that they don't harm people, whether by what they say or by what they do. But that's just the very basic level, right? That's if you ever have the chance to study how Muslims teach about their tradition, that's like the entry level, right? This higher level is to aspire to bring beauty and goodness and excellence into the world. And to come back to, okay.
That's great. Beauty and excellence and goodness into the world. That's a great place to
great.
Hear that last word. Okay, we'll come back. Don't worry, Professor.
Sure.
Okay, Professor Wong wished to speak to us today a little bit about Confucianism, the Confucian tradition. And then we'll just start in on some panel discussion, and I'll open with a question, but we'll hear from Professor Wong first.
Yes, thanks. First of all, let me just say it's been a great privilege to be teaching in the Good Life course with Professors Rowe and Atkins, and it's been a learning experience for me. Well, I'd have to say the foremost answer from the Confucian tradition in terms of the choices we were presented would be community. So there are more Confucians out there than I believe there might have been. It's relationship with others. When students asked Confucius what he would most like to do in his life, he answered, "I would like to bring peace and contentment to the aged, to share relationships of trust and confidence with my friends, and to love and protect the young." a good deal of Confucian ethics is the task of fashioning oneself into a trustworthy member of the community, someone who answers the call of those who depend on you. But Confucianism also recognizes that a certain vulnerability comes with that, the vulnerability of being human, of being interdependent with others who aren't always going to be able to do what perhaps they should do. And it's part of that life to accept what may happen, the loss that may come along with being a member of a community. So one story I have would be my mother, who is an immigrant to this country, once said to me she didn't understand the American pursuit of happiness. She thought the most important thing was to fulfill one's responsibilities to others. I don't think she meant to deny the importance of a subjective sense of contentment and joy. I think she meant that the subjective sense was the most durable and solid when you weren't pursuing it for its own sake, but rather doing something you could believe is meaningful and worthwhile. And relationship for Confucians is at the heart of what is meaningful and worthwhile.
Thank you, Dave.
For now.
Yeah, that's perfect. In fact, that actually leads directly into the question that I thought we could begin discussion with, because we didn't hear quite as much about it there until the end when you were telling the story about your mother's understanding. And that's the of the four options, it's the one about contentment. I mean, you will have seen in the option, it had spirituality in there, religion in there, a bunch of other stuff, a kind of posture in the world or a sense of oneself, or something like that, that would go with having a good life. That seemed to be not only an important one, but something that you all answered. The guest today answered was important. So I thought I would just open it to our panelists and say, what about contentment? What do your traditions have to say? And I'll watch you, but go ahead and unmute yourself, and you can just start talking. That's part of why we're all here together.
Go ahead, Mona.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to thank you, David, for raising that peace and contentment, because that is, I think, such a pivotal. I mean, I hear it coming up in already the way that we've started off this discussion, but I think you really, really made it explicit. Just for those of you who are not familiar, even etymologically, Islam means to enter into peace. And that is literally the whole purpose, right? Muslims believe that Abraham is the one who first gave that name of Islam and Muslims to this community in believing in one God. But the point of that is to enter into a state of peace and wholeness with oneself, with one's family, with the community, with God himself. And so much of this tradition really tries to aim at, contentment is one of these key pivotal spiritual stations, right? So how do you ultimately reach complete wholeness? And contentment is one of those saving graces or, adorning virtues that beautify a human being and just are absolutely pivotal to living a good life.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. Stoicism is an interesting philosophy because it's one that is, it's very ancient and very modern. And it's modern in the sense that it has impacted cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's ancient in that it comes out of a world that has a very different social economy. It comes out of a world that operates according to a gift economy, rather than, let's say, the type of capitalist meritocracy that we're so used to at Duke. And so a capitalist meritocracy you're familiar with, it's about achievement, and it's about the respect for rights. In a gift economy, the social order is based on reciprocity. Exchanges in which you receive gifts that you may not strictly merit, and then as a result, you pay back, which means that the chief virtue for Stoics, outside of the four cardinal virtues, a fifth virtue that is so important is a virtue of gratitude. And gratitude is related to mindfulness. Mindfulness makes gratitude, the Seneca philosopher and advisor to Nero mentioned. And so if you want to be grateful, you should reflect on the past gifts that you've received. And they are gifts, things that you may not have strictly merited, but that are undeserved, and then pay them forward in that same way. And gratitude is something that, as modern psychologists have shown, is linked very strongly to happiness. People that are habitually grateful tend to be happier as a whole. So the Stoic answer for contentment is going to talk about this virtue that is much more common in the ancient world and maybe harder to achieve in the modern world, this virtue of gratitude.
This is a great question, a really interesting discussion. And I'll add from the Christian tradition that the shape of the content life, or the shape of contentment, I think is quite at odds with contemporary life in North America and in Western liberal democracies that are really keen on emphasizing individuality and independence. I think the shape of contentment in the Christian tradition has a lot to do with this interdependence again on God, on the triune God, and on the community of those who follow Jesus. And so the shape of the content life is not about upward mobility in Christianity. A lot of scholars talk about it's actually about downward mobility, and it's about contentment even in the midst of human limitations, which are natural and occur in all our lives in different forms. St. Paul, I think somewhat famously, talks about his disposition of contentment in all circumstances and goes on to list those in New Testament letters. And I think that is an invitation that the Christian tradition extends to those who follow the triune God and worship the triune God, is that contentment is an interdependence upon God to empower us for life in the world of following God and following the teachings of Jesus. It's empowerment to love God and to love one another. And that really has little to do with the resources that we have or the state of our health or our bodily limits, but is an invitation into interdependent community and fellowship, and a sense of belonging oriented around the teachings of Jesus and how the community and the Christian community of the church in particular might carry those forth and live into them.
Thank you, Dr. Barton. I mean, one of the interesting questions that emerges from what the three of you have said and what Professor Wong shared at the end about his mother's understanding is this question about, I mean, how much should we actually expect to be content in this life? I mean, there's a sense that we think we ought to, 100%, 50%. How good, in other words, should life actually be expected to be? And what, given the obstacles and the things that come up, and some of them are quite ineradicable. I mean, what is it that we actually should expect out of life when we're thinking about a good life, according to your traditions?
Well, I would say that in the Chinese tradition, generally, there's a concern not to get too high and not to get too low. And that's to be expected, precisely because we depend on so many other people. And in this day and age, we depend on the environment and unfortunately what we're doing to it. And again, there's a sense of the recognition of one's vulnerability. But the consolation of that is that we share it with others.
And if I could add, it's fascinating. It's an excellent question, because in the Islamic tradition, contentment is a sign of love amid tribulation, right? Amid all the turbulence. And having a good life is not saying that your life will be easy, that everything will go your way. To the contrary, life in this world, in this temporal world, is by definition one of turbulence and upheaval and distress. So the idea of contentment is not having everything go your way, but resilience and a contentment and an ease of the soul that is able to transcend that. And that's why, contentment in the sort of Islamic spiritual teachings is the end of the spiritual training, right? Because you have to go through repentance and patience and perseverance and gratitude, and asceticism and awe and all these other stations before you can reach the station of love that is true, right? Not just a love on the tongue, but one that emanates from the heart. And then contentment flows out of that because you're then in a state of spiritual bliss. So before you can even kind of add on all of those adorning traits of the virtues, you have to deal with all the mess that human beings are, right? And this is just on the individual level, right? All the things that are familiar across traditions, and really well developed in Islamic spiritual training about, well, how do you deal with, how do you deal with arrogance? How do you deal with gluttony? How do you deal with pride? How do you, trying to remember all of our destructive vices here, anger.
That'd be a long list, Mona.
Right? 10. It's actually 10. So it's but 10 and comprehensive.
Yeah.
And so I actually wanted to ask a question about what the other stations were, or the virtues for Jed, Professor Atkins, because I think there are these resonances of how you elevate a human being out of that. And there's also a recognition that it's not just on the individual level, but how do we then also achieve social justice? I mean, that's a whole other conversation that maybe we can open up. I won't go down that path right now.
Yeah, I was going to say we actually only have a few minutes before we're going to go to our breakout room. So, Professor Atkins, if you want to say something very concisely, I'll try to make a couple of quick summary remarks, and then we'll go to our breakouts.
Yeah, I'll bring you all into the classroom, because one of the things we talk about in the Good Life class a lot, and our colleague Abdullah Antepli, who teaches Islam for us, loves to make this point, that you learn by pay attention not just to the similarities, but to the differences between the traditions. And I want to draw a difference between Stoicism and certainly Christianity and the Abrahamic traditions as a whole, and that is gratitude is so important, and the traditions will share this. But hope is such an important virtue for the Christian tradition in particular, and it's a vice for Stoics. And it comes down to this. Christianity has some kind of account, in Islam too, of the life to come. And so the good life is not contained or completed in this life, but finds its completement and its fulfillment in the life to come, even as you can partake in the good life to some degree now. For Stoicism, there is no life to come in that sense, which means that the good life is here and now. And if you're going to enjoy the good life, you have to participate in it fully here and now. And a hope that focuses on a deity to bring about that good life. For the Stoic point of view, gives up your autonomy. It's to farm out the good life to someone else when we ourselves have the resources to find the good life here and now. And that's a huge difference that I would emphasize for you.
Thank you. A lot of good stuff, and we're just getting started. This is why you should all come and take the course. You can go back to your sophomore year somehow and time travel and come take the Good Life course. And one of the things that's interesting to me about those final two comments from Professor Hassan and Professor Atkins, and we can take these into the breakout room or discuss whatever we'd like there. Death. Death is not usually the cheeriest of subjects, and it's often avoided in multiple ways. We have strategies for avoiding talking about it, but all of the traditions that are represented here today have something to say about death. And in a sense, it's critical to realize what it is that they say about that, because that is death is the boundary that makes it intelligible to us that we need to work on our good life in the time that we've been given. We don't have a million years to work on it. If we're eaten up with resentment, if we're eaten up with other things. We don't have the year 4,327 to aim for to be free of those things. We've got to think within the span, and we're not always sure, or not sure really at all from the majority of us, when that span will finally end. So a lot of good questions, a lot of good discussion. We're going to go to breakout rooms now. I hope that you had a good discussion in your breakout rooms, and I think we have time for one final question for our panelists before we finish our session. And it's at one hand, very simple, and on another hand, very complicated question, and it's this. What is one last thing you would offer to our audience and what they can take away with them as they walk away from our conversation this afternoon?
The final thought today is, as we were talking about in our breakout room, we live in a culture in which there are a lot of forces that shape us in different ways. Some of them shape us and authorities that shape us in different ways. And some of these forces and authorities are very explicit, and some of these are very implicit. And in the pressures of life, especially in the pressures of a modern life, sometimes it can be difficult to reflect, and we might even get cynical. Is the good life even possible? That question that Kevin, you said sort of this whole conversation begins upon, is the good life possible? And I think at the basic level, I would hope that I would end on a notion of hope, that I would encourage those on the call that good life is possible, and that a very worthwhile sort of way of thinking about your life's vocation in the broadest possible sense is the search for the good life. Keep looking until you find it.
Thank you, Professor Atkins. Professor Barton.
Thank you all. I will let my last word be what one of the last words was going to be in the breakout room before we were all whisked back in here. So apologies for the suspense, but it will be resolved right now. We were talking about the work of Helen Prejean, who's an abolitionist worker. She's an American nun, and she had shared many years ago on National Public Radio. I don't say what I believe to know what constitutes the good life or how I'm pursuing the good life, but I look at what I do to know what I believe. And so I think my invitation at the end of this really rich panel is for us each to look at what we do and see how that aligns with our traditions, or how that's challenged or expanded by some of the assumptions and themes, core themes of the traditions that have been represented here today on the panel, and take an invitation to not only look inside, but look at how we are in the world, and have that reveal to us what we might believe about the good life. And with that information, go forth.
Thank you, Dr. Barton. Professor Hassan, please.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on actually going back to one of the last things Professor Atkins said before we went into our breakout rooms, because we ended up talking about it in our breakout session as well, that, certainly the Islamic tradition is very concerned about how to achieve the good life, or a good life, in this world and in the next. And certainly what you were saying, Kevin, right, that, we all human beings agree about death, and that for Muslims, this idea of moral accountability is so absolutely central to the faith and to the tradition and the practice, and that the word Sharia, which has gotten such bad press, is literally what it means is the path to life-giving water, right? And so its fundamental goals are to preserve life for all, to preserve religion for all, to preserve family and dignity, to preserve reason, and to preserve property and wealth, but also to share it, right? Everybody, somehow we all get in our world history classes that one of the obligations of a Muslim is to share their wealth. And so again, to remember that, it's not a choice between doing well for oneself or doing well for others, but that the boat rises when we all partake and we all share. And yes, this really important part of that is getting things right for ourselves within ourselves, but then helping others as well. And so there are a couple of resources that I had shared in my group, and I'll just close out with that in case anybody wants to look into further. But one of the really important classical thinkers who's looked into, what does it mean to attain happiness or live a good life is Al-Ghazali. And I can put that in the chat.
Yeah. I was going to say, Professor House, we're actually going to, Joe said, we're actually going to send a follow-up email to
Okay,
the
great.
whole group with suggestions for further
Great.
reading and further
Wonderful.
discovery and all of that. So
Excellent.
we'll do that.
But we'll save it for them.
That's right. Thank you so much. Great. Professor Wong.
Yes, I began talking about gratitude and community as very close together. And this concept of paying forward that Professor Atkins mentioned in his talk, that makes for community. Receiving help and paying it forward is what makes for community. And I think we ended up talking about our felt need to repair relationships in our larger community, reestablishment of belief in each other's goodwill, which is often hard to find these days, and need to encounter people outside the communities we're most comfortable in. And we also talked about the question of equity of resources. Maybe it wasn't mentioned so much because by and large, we're a fortunate community here at Duke, and we've gotten a good start. And we don't realize how crucial that can be, how draining it can be to have to worry about enough resources.
Thanks, David. Okay, friends, it has been a wonderful and rich discussion. I just want to say by way of ending that the Good Life course is for sophomores, but we don't teach the course as if it is an information gathering course so that when you're finished with it in your sophomore year, you're done, you have all the questions answered, and it's all wrapped up. What we hope to impart to these students in their sophomore year is a set of skills and habits and a way of looking at things and addressing questions and discovering questions so that they have a shot at something like a good life thereafter. It's a trajectory setting course, not simply a dissemination of information. And if you want to know more about the Transformative Ideas Project or the Good Life course, Professor Atkins has a whole living learning community and a whole range of things that buttress what we're doing in that course. Thank you so much, colleagues, for your wisdom, for the richness of our conversation, to all of you for showing up for today. We greatly appreciate and are delighted to have been here.